Okay, back for part 3. Now, the language I was using for those 5 pillars are very much a Jewish presentation, but just also to start thinking about these issues that we've been dealing with all of these religions. What does Judaism believe about these things? So sin and human nature are very much connected, the afterlife, suffering, and the role of ritual, which I've mentioned before. So let's start with the idea of sin. The Hebrew word for sin means transgress, to go astray, even to get lost, right? I haven't done this with other religions very much, but to contrast that with the Greek word and therefore the Christian understanding of the word for sin um, means to miss the mark. So the Greek word for sin, therefore the word used in the New Testament, means miss the mark, and it's a term for archery, which is to say we're aiming and we miss. Whereas, think about where you start, in a sense, when you define sin as different. In the Greek Christian tradition, you start with a goal, and you either make it or you don't make it. In the Hebrew tradition, you're living your life, and sometimes you get lost and sometimes you don't. So this idea of sin, it starts to take us in different directions. So again, sin is defined more by actions than anything inherent to the human being. They very much, and you can see down here, reject the view of original sin. If you are part of the covenant, if you are in a covenant relationship with God, you are right with God. You are righteous. The law, the Torah, the laws assume the central, the inherent goodness of people, and so the Jew who is in covenant is right with God, but occasionally certain behaviors or breaking the law, and that's both a ritual and moral issue for them. So touching a dead body would mean you're not right with God, as would murder. Obviously, they would understand there's a difference there, but you start in a place where you are right with God, and then certain actions knock you out of that relationship. And so the Torah includes rituals that can put you back in right relationship, that correct or your relationship with God. So again, it's if I'm trying to be clear here, the difference is between the Hebrew and the Greek and the Jewish and the Christian is where humans start. You start fundamentally okay and occasionally get lost. You start fundamentally not okay and you're trying to make it right. So this proper observance of Torah keeps you in the right relationship, and you are good to go. And there are even things built into the ritual, the Torah, the liturgy, forgiveness is all a part of it. But where you start is what makes the difference. So, and they get this. Let's see, let me create some more space here. That there is no concept of original sin. So here I do have the picture of Adam and Eve in the garden, and in Christianity we talk about this as the fall. I'm going to pause for a second. Hold on. Okay. I don't know if you can see that little thing on my screen. I don't know what it means. We're going to ignore it. So Adam and Eve, under the Christian understanding, particularly the Augustinian understanding, when they ate the fruit, sin entered the world, and we are by nature inherently in a state of sinfulness. That is the Christian understanding. Jews do not read the story that way. They read the Adam and Eve story as in Genesis 1, everything is good. But our life, our world isn't good like God says it is. How did that happen? This is the story of how corruption and sin entered the world. The word sin is not used for the Adam and Eve story. So basically, they put less attention on Genesis 2 and 3 and more attention on Genesis 1. This idea that we are made in the image of God, and therefore we are good, right? To be made in the image of God. Sin is then something more defined not by who we are, but by our actions. And again, this very strong concept that what is it that is expected of us? What does it mean? What does the image of God mean? It is our moral sense of right and wrong, and we can live in relationship with God without this understanding of original sin. And so this concept of very place, if it helps, again, I keep using the same metaphor, but hopefully it helps. We start in a different place in Judaism versus Christianity in our relationship to sin and to God. So, moving on to the idea of the afterlife, this is another moving target when it comes to Judaism. The Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, has only one clear reference to life after death. So that predominantly the biblical view, we talk about the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, is that there is no afterlife. Sheol then, which is the term used, is a metaphor for not existing anymore. So it is a metaphor. So we go to it, in the use of the metaphor, we die and we go to Sheol. God cannot find us in Sheol, all the multiple ways that Sheol is talked about, but it's all basically an understanding of not existing. So Daniel 12 then is the first verse in the Bible, the only verse in the Hebrew Bible that indicates the belief in a life after death. It appears to be understanding of resurrection, but I also want you to understand that Daniel, this part of the book of Daniel, is probably dates from the 160s BCE, and so is one of the last books of the Hebrew Bible to come into existence, right? So 99.999, no view of life after death, but you do get it appearing for the first time in the book of Daniel. As we move into the rabbinic period and the writing of the Talmud, you do then get a sense of, it picks up on this Daniel tradition and Judaism for many centuries, this idea of Olam Haba, the world to come. But they are not as clear as to what that means, that there is an afterlife, a world to come, but what is it? Immortality. So just to remind you, immortality is the belief that some part of us never dies, but has a continuing existence, versus resurrection, which is very much here. We die and we are brought back to life for God. And so this idea of judgment, all of that would have been part of Talmudic, and then continuing into Orthodox and conservative religious traditions. Whereas today, in the 21st century, most other Jewish groups have no belief in life after death. So that is where predominantly, I think, that if you just look at sheer numbers, there is no sense of afterlife in the modern Jewish context. So then this idea of suffering, which, it did it again. So this idea of suffering is also something that each religion has dealt with differently. I think the Hindu Buddhist tradition, it's an illusion. It's something we need to slough off, whatever. Whereas I think that in the Jewish tradition, it is very real. The physical world is very real in the Jewish tradition. It is something to rejoice in and to revel in all that God has created, but it also brings suffering. It is part and parcel of our existence. So we do see then some of the ways in the biblical material that y'all are probably familiar with, the Psalms, and this idea that God is that these are writings that are reflective of us talking to God. So you get all that implication that comes from that God listens, that God responds. Again, this idea of a personal God. The lament then, in the real short one, if you want to look it up, is Psalm 13. Lament, another word for lament is complaint. And we spend a lot of time complaining to God, if by that we encompass the very idea that we can ask God for help. So the very idea that we can pray to God, that God listens, that we can ask when things are going wrong for help and aid from the divine is all part of the way that the Jewish tradition has articulated the role of suffering. And of course, just got to mention the book of Job as one of the most significant books written in terms of the suffering for world literature. But again, as hopefully you've started to figure out, what suffering means in any given religious tradition depends on how you understand the physical world, but it also involves how you understand God. So if the physical world isn't real, then physical suffering isn't real. If God does, so that solves that problem, but also the idea that Judaism affirms a loving, personal God also is part and parcel of how we talk about suffering in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So the nature of God. But I think that ultimately, since there are no answers to the problem of suffering in this lifetime, what Judaism teaches is that it's inevitable, and very much for the Jewish people in their own histories. But it can have meaning, and one must look for that meaning, which means staying engaged in one's relationship with God. So we continue to look up and to pray and engage in God, engage with God in argument and complaint and response. So, a brief comment on the way that Judaism has shaped the conversation around suffering. So finally, religious rituals are very much a part of the Jewish tradition nowadays. Less so for the Reconstruction. They all have various rituals. So which ones you hold on to and how firmly you hold on to, that's the moving target. But it's very much an understanding in traditional views of Judaism that the law, ritual, and the Torah, it comes from the Torah, and therefore if God says it, that's what we do, right? So the ceremonies are like the moon, they have no light of their own. They are from God, and they reflect God to us. But I think another element that is so much a part of the Jewish tradition over the centuries is the idea of making the ordinary sacred. So a lot of the rituals revolve around the very simple things of eating and family life, and the rituals about hand washing and entering into the Passover and lighting of candles and things like that. So the idea of making life sacred. And again, it goes back, this world is real. So we bring God into it. Also, I think there's very much, the rituals are often, many of them organized around not just a practice, but a way of instilling values. So the rituals teach us how to behave, how to think, that they organize our approach to the world so that we more reflect that ethical understanding of God. But also then in a more practical sense, many of the rituals actually sort of put you into the experiences of fundamental experiences of Judaism. So as this says, when it comes to the Passover meal, in every generation, each individual should feel as if he had personally come out of Egypt. They have all these things built into the Passover Seder meal and to other rituals over time that, yes, indeed, we are with our ancestors, and that God that came to Abraham, the God that came to Moses, that is coming to all of us in each ritual. So that is that. We'll come back to talk about the Jewish holidays.